Well, we know that kindergarten's all about learning. We know that K through 12 is all about learning, and people go on to college, and that's all about learning. And then now we're done, right? We graduate, we go get a job, and now we know what we need to know, and we go perform. But I believe it's the perpetual learners, the lifelong learners, who truly excel and advance both their organizations, themselves, and humanity as a whole. And so that's what we're here to talk about.
Yeah, that brings to mind for me, Satya Nadella, when he took over at Microsoft, said, I'm going to shift this place from a culture of know-it-alls to a culture of learn-it-alls. And, the stock has tripled or quadrupled in the time that he has been driving that shift. So I think there might be something to it. And on that note, before we dig in, let's welcome you to episode 5 of Happy Heuristics, shock-resistant leader routines and rules of thumb for a complex world. And if you've listened to any of their episodes of this podcast, you know the premise, that we operate in a complex, volatile world, and there's so much stuff coming at us. It actually is really more than our brains have computational power to process, even though we'd like to think it's different. So instead of getting paralyzed or freaked out, the alternative is to have a stock of reliable heuristics or happy heuristics that are going to help you make the right decision much of the time without having to think too damn hard about it.
Yeah, so it's about consistency, it's about speed, and it's about simplicity, right? Kind of taking some of the complexity out. And so, again, for return listeners, we pick a theme, we pick a couple heuristics, each pick a heuristic and kind of stress test it, explain it, and help people understand the world through that lens. And this time, as we talk about the theme of learning, being learning oriented, you certainly meet people that might operate that way, but most people seem to aspire to, right? Mm-hmm. They seem to aspire to be a learner. It's not that they have to be convinced that it's good, but how do we put some rules in place to help us do that more consistently? So that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, sounds good. You want to go first this week?
Yep. So my heuristic is make all career decisions based on how much you will learn. It's a pretty bold statement. Now this is one that I'll say a little detour around how we use heuristics. Some heuristics are ones we use every day. I think we kind of covered those in episode 4. Others, career decisions don't come up every day.
Right.
But how do we make decisions and sort of pack forward old learnings, but be able to manage those key moments in some consistency. So that's mine. Make all career decisions based on how much you will learn. Mm-hmm. So my own journey, my own personal journey is I've sort of had 3 opportunities where I took a pay cut. And so that's how I knew this heuristic was really a heuristic and not just an easy thing to say, check a box on.
Right.
So I took three different times. I took a significant pay cut in order to learn more, in order to be on a different trajectory of learning. Once was when I left Chrysler. I literally emptied my bank account to exit an employment contract because I thought there'd be more learning in the work we were going to go do at DT Energy. Huh. And that was a big, bold decision, but turned out well in the long run. Did it again when I started the Lean Learning Center, over 20 years ago. And then on a sort of a side version of that, I left a board where I joined a new board where I was making about a third for the same time commitment. But again, I had kind of learned what I needed to learn there, and I thought I'd learn more in this different board. And so, but each of those decisions really worked out very well for me in the long run and the short run. And I guess we'll cover some of that. But that's, if you say, hey, I'm going to learn more and I'll make more money, well, that's an easy decision, right?
Right.
So how do I know that the learning was really the important thing? Well, because I was making less money in each of those decisions.
Right. This is not just a narcissistic story you're telling retrospectively that happens to be convenient.
Yeah.
This is you had skin in the game. You actually made a trade-off.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's how we know if we're thoughtful about the decisions when there is a real trade-off to make. That's how we know what's important there.
Right. Okay. So what's the I guess part of this is like actually taking into account in your equation of what is in your self-interest things that are hard to compute, right? Because the learning piece of that, I don't know how it's easy to count dollars. Mm-hmm. It's easy to count compensation, inherently objectively, measurable. And the tricky part, including learning in the equation, is knowing how the hell to build that in to the equation.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's useful as a rule, because you can't compute the learning, right?
Right.
So you just kind of say, forget it.
Right.
I'm not going to try to compute it. I'm just going to go for it, right? Because and then you don't have to worry about the computational trade-off.
Right. Exactly.
And so I think there's a couple reasons why that rule is so important. One is that careers are a trajectory. Right? We like to tell people, you can always change your mind later, but there's still a trajectory behind it. You still are benefiting from past decisions on the pathway that you're on. And so there's always, career decisions should always be based about a longer term perspective than we're usually making them on. Mm-hmm. Right? And learning is what pays us off in the future. Right? So I think that fundamental learning is about the future and your ability to provide value in the future. And so that's one reason that trade-off starts to be more obvious in the long term. I think second is no matter what we're dealing with, there's challenges, there's problems we have to solve, and learning is about our pathway through. And quite frankly, if we don't have challenges to overcome that require learning, we're probably just doing a job. We're not adding a lot of value.
Right.
We're filling a hole. We're a cog in the system. But solving new problems, uncovering new decisions, that requires learning if we're going to do it well. And so that's how we actually add value, mm-hmm. which sets us up for promotion and other things like that. And then third, and this might be one that's not the same amount of true for everybody.
Yeah.
But that learning is energy. Learning is what kind of feeds the soul.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite quotes is Henry Ford said, "Anyone who stops learning is dead, whether they're 8 or 80."
Yeah, that's great. I hadn't heard that. Okay.
Yeah, and it's kind of who knows with Henry Ford? You never know whether he said it or someone just wrote that he said it, But fundamentally, I think that's true. It's like I want to be that's what being a lifelong learner is, and that's sort of making career decisions around. I'll use that first example of leaving Chrysler and going to DT Energy is, okay, I'm gonna sit here and churn, right? Or I'm gonna go over there and be energized. And boy, there's no amount of money that to me that's worth doing a job that doesn't energize you at some level.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, believe me, I'm all about the brain candy. I think that's a big part of my equation, and it's been useful for me even in just this short conversation so far to have you articulate the heuristic like that, because I know sometimes in terms of like in our professional services, what we charge for stuff, or whether we go something was worthwhile or not worthwhile. And sometimes I think I am maybe not being fully responsible to my business partners, because I know I do count actually the amount of brain candy that something is going to deliver into whether I think something was worthwhile or not. Mm-hmm. And there's no official accounting for that.
Right.
And this gives me more confidence to say, and I don't care. I mean,
right, because aren't your partners also going to benefit from a more engaged Jeff? Right?
Yeah, right.
One who's excited about what we're doing, and learning is some of that brain candy, that fuel for the soul, right? And so I think that's why again, you can do the analytical math and try to do a pro and con, but fundamentally, I think career paths are about injecting the best into us and getting the best out of us.
Yeah, right.
And so, boy, if learning isn't part of it, then both of those things sort of no longer are true. So, and that's, another favorite quote of mine, kind of makes that expectation around the archway, which is from Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, which is learn as if you'll live forever, live as if you'll die tomorrow. So
that's pretty good. Yeah.
So sort of like, live for today, right? Be immersed in the moment and don't just put everything off to the future, but learn as if, there's always going to be an opportunity to benefit from that learning, or to pay it back, or to utilize it to advance yourself, your company, your organization, society as a whole, whatever that might be. And so I think that's why that of those three reasons, right? Career trajectory all the way through the fuel. Perhaps the career trajectory becomes less important the further you are in your career, but at the same time, perhaps the energy, the fuel for the soul is even more important the further you are in your career. You may not need to work as much. So what's going to keep you engaged and loving what you do? And I think learning is that for many people.
Yeah. And that reminds me of something I stumbled on not too long ago. And actually, you're the lean guru, and I saw this thing called Lean Fire. Do you know what this is?
No.
Yeah, so I thought it had something to do with lean, and this might be one of those other things I'm remembering wrong, and I'll fix it in the show notes if I did. But I swear it was like Lean Fire, and I'm like, what the heck is that? Like the new version of is that Agile Lean? What is that?
Right.
Something. Jamie's probably on top of this, but what it is like this movement about really saying, you're nuts if you think that a corporation is going to take care of you. The deal has changed, and so part of taking on self-authorship here means that you play by your own rules, and that it's not about and that it's about making enough money by X period of time where you go, okay, now I have freedom, like not FU money, but like enough freedom where you can just go on an adventure, and you can really shift the equation where it's like, whether it's adventure, learning, whatever, you get to a point where you're not, your happiness is not about status, money, material things. It's about what you can do and having a discipline to do that. So I think that is, I think this sort of notion is catching on. There's some ways that are embodying that. That might be the next, version of lean that you become the guru on.
Maybe. Well, and so, fundamentally these rules, and like most heuristics, right, they are meant to fight the human nature that works against our own best interest, and in this case, our own best long-term interest, right? And that's where I think I talk to a lot of people unhappy in their jobs, and they're like, but I don't want to, I need this money, right? I don't want to take a pay cut, but how if you're really learning and growing and contributing, how long does a pay cut really a pay cut?
Right.
And if you get on a different trajectory, if you jump over to a different, I'm on this ladder or this slide, and I'm going to jump over to that one. If it's learning oriented ladder or slide, it's a faster one to where you want to go. And so you might take a step back in order to take a step forward, and that's a hard human nature decision, but that's why I think this heuristic so important. Is it's like, that's almost right? Mm-hmm. Almost always going to pay off.
Yeah.
Right. With the ability, where it's not going to pay off is where you probably can't predict it anyway. So.
Yeah, and I think probably for both of us in a lot of the coaching we do, we have conversations with people all the time where they talk about what they're doing and rationalize it as you were describing, and when you say to people, well, to try to think about something else, it can feel like maybe you're being touchy-feely, like it's being new agey, and to me I always try to bring it back to the language of cost benefit analysis, and I go, no, that's totally cool. And what is this costing you? Mm-hmm. And to that point, in that situation, if you're in a job that is not, not providing whatever sort of brain candy that one, might get otherwise, then if it's not being moralistic or fanciful. It's about being like an actual accountant in the service of your own self-interest to go, what the hell is this costing you, and then make an enlightened decision.
Yep, absolutely. So I think we've hammered on that one pretty well. We can start to switch to our next heuristic.
Sounds good.
Okay, so I know yours is a bit different, so why don't you take me down your heuristic?
Yeah. My heuristic is mistakes are intellectual capital. I guess you should start with a verb. Treat your mistakes as intellectual capital, right? And this is a saying that I first heard from Walt Buckley. Walt Buckley was the CEO of Internet Capital Group, which is a million years ago, or maybe it was 1999. I'm not sure. It was...
Same thing.
Yeah, same thing. It was, he was the CEO of Internet Capital Group, which was, had something like 45 employees, but because it was an internet company, had a market cap that was bigger than GM's at the time, right? And then, they're setting the world on fire, and then the internet bubble burst, and they got, just got their butts kicked, right? And so he, says to his troops, the good news is we're not dead. Like, we're not dead. We can live to fight another day. But you know what? He said, I know that there's a temptation to go, just blame everything on external factors because, which is a classic human nature. I think we've talked before about, that old saying among Communist Party bosses, good crops come from good farming, bad crops come from bad weather. Mm-hmm. We give ourselves credit for our successes and we blame external factors when things go badly. So they could have just blamed, internet bubble burst. Who could have seen that coming?
Right.
And, and then rationalize that away without any hits to the ego. And he said, before we, start charging back up the hill, let's acknowledge that we were getting sloppy. And, but out of this hard-won experience, let's treat our mistakes as intellectual capital. And to me, that's really just like a phenomenal way of reframing human experience, because, again, talking about hacking our own human nature, one of the things we know is that, our brains, evolution, selected for what would help us survive long enough to procreate. It wasn't, evolution didn't care so much about, what makes you a great leader.
Right.
And so it's about understanding that, our brains that are just so defensive and so wired to keep us safe, want to keep us safe, not only from threats to our bodies, from like the saber-toothed tiger lurking around the corner, but also threats to our egos and threats to our face, right? And so when you're in an environment where mistakes are seen as sources of shame, it actually puts us in a spot to sub-optimize because, you have that hard-won experience. If your brain is trying to keep you safe and not embarrassed, and that's the way it's seen, then you have a culture that's why you train people to get really damn good at deflection, finger pointing, rationalization, minimization of problems and mistakes, instead of the learning opportunities they are. Again, you already paid for them. You're going to take the value or you're not going to take the value, right? This is, and so the tricky part though is, it's really about driving cognitive reappraisal at mass scale. But it's phenomenal when it happens, and that's an example of it. That important reframe: mistakes are intellectual capital. There are other versions of this. More recently, a guy that I'd worked with named Ahmad Tarson told me that in his son's classroom, he had seen the sign that said, mistakes are expected, inspected, and corrected. And I thought, that's awesome. That's awesome. Expected means it's normalized. Like nobody panic, a mistake happened. But it's also going to be inspected. We're going to grab the damn learning out of it, right? And then corrected is, and there's responsibility, there's accountability for doing something about it. And I think that's beautiful. And if like kids got that embedded in their heads early, that would be a really phenomenal thing. From a different perspective, something I think is interesting is, there's this movement. So I don't have to turn on the explicit tag, when we load up our I won't say what it's really called, but it's F up nights. Mm-hmm. And Anchor makes you turn on the explicit tag if you're going to say the F word, so I'm not going to say it. But F up nights are like this reverse TED Talk where the idea is, you have people do these TED Talkish talks where they talk about, some, epic failure and then what they've learned from it. And again, it's this really nice version of cognitive reappraisal where going from mistakes are sources of shame to mistakes can be badges of honor if you learn from them. I think is a really is a great example of hacking human nature and driving this cognitive reappraisal that actually puts us all in a better spot to operate more rationally without letting our own defensive brains get in the way.
Yeah, and I think it begins with that, expect and really celebrate in a way in order to set yourself up for extraction. You know my friend Mark Rabin a little bit, but Mark and I have another podcast called Lean Whiskey together, and he's very prolific writer, author, and podcaster, and he has a whole podcast called My Favorite Mistake, which is about other people's mistakes and what they learn from it, right? And so he's really trying to celebrate and honor learning. And I think that it's the first sort of psychological response, right? When other people make mistakes, we shame and blame. When we make a mistake, we move on and quietly, don't look over here and pretend that was just an anomaly. But we miss the opportunity to build intellectual capital. You talked about, you kind of opened with the internet crash as that just couldn't see that coming.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of people today are saying, well, we couldn't see the pandemic coming, but
right.
E-Trade, as an example, I'm sure they're not the only company, they had it on their risk management plan.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, they of course, they didn't know this was coming now, but as they looked at risk management, they go, one of the risks that we should be prepared for is a pandemic, right? And of course, we've known about pandemics for a very long time. They're not new things. It's just, it's like a lot of things, it's low probability, high impact. And that's really the lesson, is that our risk management systems are biased towards the higher probability, but perhaps lower impact, versus the high impact, low probability.
Yeah.
But in terms of risk planning, those might benefit more.
Right.
From being prepared for the, military and intelligence services and things like that. They spend a lot of time preparing for the low probability. People spend their entire career planning for a low probability but high impact event. But in business and in life, we tend not to, right? We tend not to. But the point of the E-Trade example is there are lessons to extract from that. Why didn't we see it coming? Why didn't we have a plan? Okay, well, we could either explain it away or we could extract lessons from it.
Yeah. And now that you say it, it reminds me that Nassim Taleb, who wrote Black Swan, is very very emphatic about saying, when he's asked about the pandemic, this is not a Black Swan event. Mm-hmm. This specific thing was not predicted, but the fact that it would be a pandemic, not a Black Swan.
Right.
Not a Black Swan.
Exactly.
Not a Black Swan.
I think we shouldn't call it. Calling it that is sort of an example of explaining it away.
Exactly.
Right? It's like, there's nothing we could have done about it, but it was a gray swan event. It was foreseeable.
Yeah.
So I think the key here is our first reaction to a mistake and then our second reaction, right? Our first reaction, it's not shame or blame or explain away. It's bring out in the open and make it transparent. And then the second reaction is turn it into intellectual capital, right? Learn from it in a deliberate way.
Yeah. And I think, one thing that I should acknowledge is, like your heuristic is that you shared is like a real heuristic, a situational heuristic that can guide decisions where one's computational power might be otherwise taxed, right? And that's in comparison to this one, which, someone might go, treat mistakes as intellectual capital sounds more like a guiding principle or more like a mantra, because there's very few situations where you go, I'm stumped. I don't know whether to treat this mistake as a source of shame or a source of intellectual capital. Should I buy a Toyota pickup or should I buy a Ford pickup?
Right.
I mean, it's not one of those things. But it is, I think, a good mantra, because if you have a culture where people are saying that enough, where people are invoking that enough, then you create an environment where in those moments of truth, where people can either get in reactive defensive mode or they can get in creative solution mode. You can keep them at, the sufficient invocation of mantras like that. You pull people out of the reptile brain and back into the prefrontal cortex, which, by the way, is what you are paying them for, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you hired them based on what they were capable of doing with their prefrontal cortex, not what's in their reptile brain. And so, part of investing in that culture, part of investing in that cognitive reappraisal is getting to a point where you can actually realize the investment that you made in talent.
Yep. Yeah. And I think perhaps I agree. It's kind of a mantra. Perhaps turning it into a more of a heuristic is something around, and this could take us down a pretty deep rabbit hole, but design your systems to treat mistakes as intellectual capital.
Right.
Right. So it's like whether it's your strategic planning process or your day-to-day execution system or your meeting routines or your hiring practices, right? As you design and build those systems of work, are you designing them to leverage mistakes, mm-hmm. right? Or are we keeping them transparent? Are we engaging in them? Are we focusing on the system? Are we versus the person? And are we learning from them and turning into lessons? I think any time we touch a process that involves humans, right? We should be looking at how do we design it in order to treat mistakes as intellectual capital.
Yeah. And one thing that comes to mind in terms of doing that is, I was thinking about Annie Duke, who I probably mentioned 3 or 4 times, the poker pro who talks about resulting, which is, resulting is judging a process strictly based on outcomes, which means, failing to take into account luck. So sometimes you can actually play poker pretty lousy, but luck into a win, and pat yourself on the back and take no learning from it. And sometimes you can play well, you can play exactly what you should do, and the cards are just not in your favor and you lose, right? And so, and resulting is really an opportunity to say there's learning either way. And mm-hmm. and one thing I think you and I've talked about and are both fans of is creating a system where, for example, you do after action reviews or retrospectives or whatever, even when things go well.
Right.
Because there are learnings even when things go well. And I think just as importantly, when you only do, a post-mortem when things go wrong, then it creates that cloud over it where people are not coming into that environment focused primarily on learning. They're focused on how do I make sure that somebody else takes the blame.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just remember, way back when I was at Chrysler, we had intended to build a system around learning, and it was around product launches, right? So product launch in automotive is a pretty big deal. But the report was called the What Went Right, What Went Wrong report. And it was about 3 pages on what went right and about 80 on what went wrong. But pretty much what you did, because it wasn't a meeting, it wasn't a discussion, it was just a document that people would populate. And you'd kind of leaf through it, look for your name, right? See if you were blamed, and I wasn't blamed, and then you'd move on.
Awesome.
But it wasn't. I think that's the important thing is making sure that we are setting it up to be about the lesson and not about the blame.
Yeah.
That's how we get the most success out of that.
That story is just really beautifully, I think, sort of captures, like, boils it down to the binary choice, which is this an exercise in ego preservation, or is it an exercise truly in learning and improving?
Yeah, and these heuristics is about more about the latter, and that's what we're trying to do. So that's a good one. That's a good one that fits on a T-shirt and probably could be on our screensaver or sticker on our laptops and so on. So we appreciate everyone joining us for this episode. As we explore these heuristics around learning, consider the lessons of the heuristics and the lessons about using heuristics, right? Mm-hmm. And how they take many different shapes, whether it's low use, high impact, or everyday kind of heuristics. And so we're hopefully making people more thoughtful and deliberate about both adopting heuristics and designing and using them themselves.
Yeah. And so we hope that you will, if you got something out of us, you will rate us, review us, tell other folks about us. You can find us at jflinch.com/happy heuristics or mgstrat.com happy heuristics. What else do we want to cover today?
Well, we love ending with a sort of simple bonus heuristic, and just to kind of provide examples of what we mean, so we don't over-intellectualize this theme. So this bonus heuristic is everything is better with bacon.
That's true. I would add butter to the equation as well.
Butter probably works, and like all heuristics, they don't work 100% of the time.
Exactly.
But they work often enough that it's still worth remembering.
Absolutely.
There we go.